Coming to you from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. This is The Gailey Show. I am your host, JP Darbagosian. Today, it's our Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode for the week, where we sit down with a special guest for the entire episode to help us think more clearly on the major issues of the day facing the queer and allied community. After that, in our final segment, I will continue my Queer and the Cosmos essay series. Today, our guest is Louisa Hext. Louisa is a transformational coach, speaker, and mediator with over 30 years of experience helping individuals and families navigate forgiveness, healing, and personal growth. Drawing from her research and nearly 13 years as the curator of a highly regarded traveling photographic exhibition on forgiveness, Louisa has been privileged to guide countless individuals through profound emotional healing. Her coaching practice is built on empathy, deep curiosity, and a non-judgmental approach, creating a safe space for her clients to explore their unique stories and unlock their potential for growth and transformation. Whether helping clients release long-held resentments, rebuild relationships, or cultivate self-compassion, Louisa is a trusted partner in guiding them toward the peace and freedom that true forgiveness offers. And also, Louisa is our guest this week on This Queer Book Saved My Life, a new episode that dropped on this past Tuesday, and the book that we were discussing was Ruby Fruit Jungle by Rita Mae Brown. I'm getting all my Louisa Hext this week. I just think it's absolutely marvelous. So you can check out that episode everywhere you get your podcast or at thisqueerbook.com. For right now, Louisa, welcome to The Gailey Show.
Well, thank you, JP. What a great gift to be here with you today. I'm so grateful, truly.
It is a gift, and we're going to be talking about a subject that is very interesting, that I think is very relevant, but also maybe bringing up a lot of emotions for folks as they hear about just the topic of the idea. So we're talking about forgiveness and self-forgiveness today in the work that you do. So maybe we can start by defining, like, what does that mean, like forgiveness and self-forgiveness? Like, what is it and what is it not? Because I'm sure it brings up a lot of things for folks, as I'm sure you know, and when you've done all of your coaching and webinars.
Well, yeah, and that's a really loaded question, JP. I mean,
Gotta start out big.
Yeah, there's the Webster definition, right? And the Oxford definition, and then there's our definition. I think that most importantly, there is no specific definition. It starts with self, starts with our own understanding of what forgiveness is or isn't. And it does start with self-forgiveness. People think often, hey, well, I can forgive that person, that instance, that circumstance. Forgive myself? Absolutely not. Yet it starts with ourselves. Forgiveness is a process, it's a choice. Let me repeat that. It's a choice. It takes internal work, discipline, and it requires this sense of relinquishing the right to judgment, the right to bitterness and resentment. So if you're holding on to something that's really bugging you, whether it relates to self or another, or right now, our community, our country, sure, we could get into that in this conversation. It requires a willingness to know yourself, to be curious, to broaden your perspective of the issue at hand, be an investigator, an understander of the circumstances, and potentially be empathetic to the life and the story of another, creating meaning in our lives. So it's really, really very, very loaded. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. And I think you asked me what forgiveness isn't. Did you ask me what it isn't as well? So this is really, really important. People pair these actions, these steps to releasing pain and suffering with condoning unfair or unacceptable behavior. That's not what forgiveness is. It's not letting someone off the hook. It's not forgetting. People have often heard the term forgive and forget or the
Hmm.
adage. It's not that at all. It's potentially considering another way of living your life, remembering differently, transforming your story, speaking your story. It's certainly not moving on and pretending that something didn't happen to yourself or another person. It also does not require reconciliation. The suggestion that if you are going to forgive someone, you're going to sit across the table from them and have this kumbaya moment, this, oh, well, now I have to be in that person's life. It's for yourself. So everything you do can be with yourself or with that other individual. And when we think about reconciling, in some instances, we want to be able to do that. It could be a family member, for example, who's very important to us, or a friend, or you want to redefine a personal relationship after there has been an instance where you've been let down or hurt.
Hmm.
And it's certainly not a negotiation with another person or the universe or a higher power. That's a lot, isn't it?
It is a lot. And I think thank you for doing the breakdown between what it is and what it isn't, because I feel like in the conversations I've been having since the catastrophe in November,
Yeah.
that people aren't necessarily in the forgiving mood.
And it's
How?
not required, by the way. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No,
It's
yeah,
not
I want to hear.
required. Well, the point is that so often when we talk about the language of forgiveness, there's the expectation that we take an action to forgive, and that is not required. And food for thought, in the heat of conflict, in the heat of the pain and suffering, it is not recommended to forgive.
Mm,
So we can talk about that.
yeah, go tell me more.
Well, there's the suggestion that you got to forgive, you got to forgive, you got to forgive, you got to move on, you got to move on. Let's just slow down and consider what one's experience is when there has been what we define as an atrocity or an action or an outcome. And when you mention November, I think you may be referring to the election. Is
Yeah.
that what? Yeah, okay. So it takes a while to walk in it, right?
Hmm.
I mean, the fact that I might come along as a coach and say, well, you just got to forgive. Let's just move on. Let's just drop that heavy bag that you're carrying because it's holding you back. The point is, it's almost a sense of protection, this moral outrage, perhaps, this sense that we have to really unpack what it is that has led us to feel enraged, unforgiving, angry. You know, it's loaded, and all of these emotions take time to process.
Hmm.
And so I define this as a journey, that this being the forgiveness path, if you choose to or not. And the outcome will be if you choose to or not. It's not a linear journey. And what does that bring up for you?
Oh, I want to know more. uh, no, everything that you're saying is really resonating with me in terms of when I hear the word forgiveness, I think of the forgetting. I think of the let's move on. I think of it's asking me to condone behavior, to an accept an apology, no matter what that behavior, whatever harm that behavior caused. So it's really resonating with me that you're saying, well, no, we're not. Don't run to that. First of all, it's not required. A, and B, that it is a I don't know if this is the right word, iterative journey that we go on. Um, and I'm also thinking of like very, things in my life, not just forgiveness meta on that like America grand scale of things and the 77 or however many it was million voters that voted for Trump and everything that he's done since the inauguration, which I'm finding uh, maybe unforgivable. I'm not quite sure. We'll see what is and isn't forgivable, I think, as we're going through our conversation. But also I'm thinking about relationships I've had with my family
Hmm.
where they've done things that, like I've been pretty upfront on the air and writing that I've done that, I've been disinherited by my family. So, that is a, I'm in therapy. I love therapy. I love my therapist and processing that and doing all of that work. That's how I sort of manage through that. But when we were talking for this Queer Book Saved My Life on that episode about this work that you do around forgiveness, I thought, wow, this is something that I'm kind of nervous about talking about. And that's where I was like, oh, I really want to have Louisa on the show because I think also just for me personally, I think it's great to have conversations with things that we find kind of like, ooh, how do I feel about that? We are coming up on a break here. So all of my questions are like big questions. I don't want to start one with less than a minute going to the break. But our guest today is Louisa Hext. Her website is embracingforgiveness.com. We're going to talk more about how Louisa came into this work, a lot of it also focusing on self-forgiveness in the coaching and in the webinars, trainings that Louisa offers as well. So keep it tuned here to The Gailey Show on AM 950 KTNF. Please support the sponsors that you hear in the next break. They keep this show and progressive news and radio on the air. So tell them when you go into their businesses or visit them online that you heard about them on The Gailey Show. Welcome back to the Gailey Show. I'm JP Dervagosian. It is Thursday, which is our time of the week for Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly. My guest is Louisa Hext. I misquoted Louisa's website before the break. Her website is embraceforgiveness.com, not embracing. It's embraceforgiveness.com. Thank you, Louisa, for being with us here today. We got into a thing about in the break. You were mentioning that there are different areas where you can do this work. You've done this work in family courts, and then there's the work that you do in personal coaching. So why don't you, talk to us through about how you approach this work in those different venues?
Well, actually, in my work as alternative dispute resolution professional, which includes mediation, evaluation, adjudication, working in the best interest of kids, I don't work around forgiveness. This is the key. If I were to say to you, and you're going through this angry separation with a person that you have children with, whether you're married legally or not, that you really must forgive this person in the heat of that conflict, what might you think about me?
Um, not
Come on.
listening, not listening,
I,
dismissive,
yeah,
not. I don't want to say naive, but like I'd feel very hurt.
yeah. It's no place for me to come along and say, you know what? I think you should just forgive the person. They didn't really mean it. And it's really an isolated incident. And that is not the work that I do in that role. So what I'm recognizing uh, and clarifying for the audience is very specifically there's a time and place to even consider this word, this action. Yes, there are benefits, and we can talk about the benefits of forgiveness. And yet, in order to move to a place of forgiveness, there is a process where you have to actually release what it is you're holding on to. And when you're in the midst of it, there's no time or place to release it. Now, another example, which I can give a true example around my father, who passed a number of years ago, that and went to his grave or wherever he is in this beautiful world, not being granted, given, gifted forgiveness by his brother, who he hadn't spoken to in 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. There may have been a time on that journey where my dad and his brother could have come together and considered what forgiveness might look like. If both parties wanted to reconcile, it would have required two people and maybe more because it all of the family stuff, the family dysfunction
Hmm.
impacts multiple people. It's not typically just the two of you, it's oftentimes, extended family, so on and so forth. It didn't happen in the case of my dad. And when he knew, I think, that he was going to die, we didn't he didn't have an illness that was a physical illness. He lived with clinical depression. He was not in a good place. And he actually asked me, would I ask forgiveness on behalf of him, which is another really hot topic,
Hmm.
because my position is that it is not appropriate for someone else to ask forgiveness on behalf of someone else. At that time, I didn't know. This was way before I was even doing this work. The point being is there was an opportunity for a conversation years previously, and my dad had tried, and his brother had refused.
Hmm.
And my dad could have done the work to forgive himself, since he was the person in this instance that felt the need to forgive himself for an action he had taken. And it didn't require his brother, but they ran out of time
Hmm.
because shortly after the request on my father's part, he had a sudden heart attack.
Mm.
And I'm not trying to guilt the audience or guilt you.
No, yeah.
I'm offering the space for inquiry. And in fact, a previous client recently who participated in a 4-week course that I teach class, she is currently writing a memoir about her father and her life. And she took the class very specifically to determine if she was going to forgive or not. And
Wow.
her perspective was, I'm going to take this class because I want to investigate, to use the language of investigation. I tend to use the language of understanding. She came in as a self-aware and curious person, and she had, I think, a couple chapters to write, and it was the last chapter, which determined whether she was going to forgive her father. And she was able to gather all the evidence, which I believe for her, and this is an important example, she chose not to forgive. And we had a little interesting conversation inside of the class about empathy. I mean, this is all so loaded. So there's so many layers. I don't want to confuse, have stack issues. So maybe we can break it apart a little bit. You're smart. You can figure that out.
This is an area that I want to uh, l- ask you more about here, and I know we're already coming up on another break. Feels like this whole conversation is just racing by. But and I want to put this maybe in the context of queer life,
Yeah.
where and I don't want to center my own story here, but I know that a lot of folks are within similar
Hmm.
circumstances where they come out, and because of their queerness or their queer life, that is the reason why they are disowned, disinherited, kicked out of their family or their home for whatever period of time that it ends up being, right? If it's a kid that's being kicked out of their house or it's an adult. I'd love to ask then more about, because you were saying something there about how your dad could have begun the work of self-forgiveness since the situation was that his brother didn't want to engage in the process. So if you don't mind, we're going to take a break, gather your thoughts, because I know there's going to be a lot of them about that
Okay.
particular
Yeah.
context, if you will.
Yeah.
Folks, thank you for sticking with us. Our guest is Louisa Hext. The website is embraceforgiveness.com, where you can check out, you can employ Louisa to be your personal coach. There are courses and also webinars that are offered there. So check that out, embraceforgiveness.com. You are listening to The Gailey Show on AM 950 KTNF. And you're back with us here on The Gailey Show. I'm JP Darabagosian, your host. With me in our virtual studio is Louisa Hext. We are thinking queerly about forgiveness. And before the break, I was asking Louisa about, let's kind of situate this idea of forgiveness and self-forgiveness within the context of a family that has a queer member that is being having any type of conflict, including being kicked out of their home or disinherited, disowned, because of specifically their queer identity and their queer life. So, Louisa, can you help begin? I know we're not going to get this in an entire episode, but can you begin to sort of unpack for us what that process can look like? What's involved with that? What are the effects of that?
Well, I want to stress the importance of self. And I touched on the importance of my dad forgiving himself.
Hmm.
He could have forgiven his brother too. The focus in this context is self. So there's this whole path, which is about self forgiveness and then also forgiveness that we might provide to another. And I'm sitting here thinking during the commercial, well, people are saying, well, what do you mean I have to forgive myself? It's about my parents who just discarded me.
Hmm.
I'm not denying that piece at all. This is really important. When I talk about people forgiving themselves, it's really to see ourselves whole and to love ourselves for who we are. Because our parents in this context have defined us as not good enough, having different expectations of us, and so on and so forth. And I think the most important thing to do as an individual that wants to consider self forgiveness is to simply acknowledge and accept your feelings without judgment. Meaning, not accept the feelings or the actions or reactions of others, and to speak your story. So, storytelling is very, very powerful. I don't mean get on a TEDx stage and share your story. You could. I'm going to be working on one of those pretty shortly. But the idea is speaking your story to someone who you trust or through journaling, self reflection, so on and so forth is powerful. It's important not to suppress or ignore your feelings. So, journaling has been considered a helpful tool. This allows us to challenge our negative self-thoughts and beliefs that are fueling self-criticism. It's very hard when there is an attack on our being from the outside for us to have that guard and the fortitude to not allow someone else's actions or thoughts to permeate the way we feel about ourselves. And self-compassion is a key part of self-forgiveness. That's treating yourself with the same kindness, understanding, and support you'd offer a friend. So in a coaching entity, if I'm working with an individual, and this is significantly different than therapy, I'm not a clinician and I'm not treating an individual or providing a diagnosis, it's a partnership,
Mm-hmm.
a guide. I'm supporting that individual to unpack the challenges that come along with potentially not being kind to ourselves, not being generous to ourselves, not being loving to ourselves, and to be able to reframe how we think and how we act in the world. And an entirely different conversation could be about the power of our neuroplasticity in our brain, that we can actually change the way that we think by affirming our being in multitudes of ways. Is that helpful in
Mm-hmm.
answering the question? I mean, it's only the beginning of the process. I think so. In your context, I don't know a lot about your circumstances, but you might want to think about a concrete example of a struggle that you experience given the estrangement from you, which I think you've used that term before, from your parents, and what comes up for you when you think about them, about yourself or about what they did to you. Make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, do you have an example that you'd be willing to share?
Oh, sure.
I don't
So
know.
yeah, it was by text a year ago. So in 2024, I got a text that basically said, you're out of the will and good luck. And that was a shock to see that because I had seen one of my parents doing that LinkedIn stalking, you know what I mean? Where you can go onto
Mm,
someone's LinkedIn page, but they
yeah,
don't I don't know if they realize that LinkedIn tells you when someone is looking at your page. You can look up and see
probably not.
who are the folks that are looking at my page. So I was entirely different conversation because there are whole things about my, that over the past few years, because I specifically wanted to work with the queer community. So my LinkedIn page has become super gay. Um, which I'm sure they're just absolutely shocked by, and in their word, in their world, rather embarrassed by that they have someone who's so unapologetically gay out in the world. But so to get that text was very shocking. It was also kind of affirming in a sense because I was
Mm,
like, okay, finally, we're finally saying what everyone, you're finally saying the truth and not dodging it, which is what I've been thinking that you're thinking. So now you've just gone ahead and done it. I was shocked. Obviously, I was angry. But if I'm getting what you're saying, I think I understand what you're saying. It might not have been the correct time, like in the week after or in the month after, or maybe even in the first like 3 months, first 90 days after to be like, okay, I need to forgive them and move on. But maybe like now having some time later is the opportunity to begin to explore the concept. Does that make sense?
you're right on. It's the space for inquiry. It's the, is this a possibility without the expectation, in this case of a coach saying, and your outcome is forgiveness, because that defeats the whole object.
Hmm.
It's asking powerful questions. One of my most exciting, I just love asking this question when people are angry, whether it's about a situation that you're describing or a really large situation, like the manner in which Trump is cutting off funding for DEI and medical care for people who identify as transgender and so on and so forth. The question
Well, not
is,
even just that, disability services and
thank you.
Medicaid, and it's
Yeah,
just
you
for
can keep
everybody
going
that they
on.
try to
I was
cut
I
off.
was just being in walk
Oh,
with
I
the
got you.
Gailey show, but we all wear multiple hats.
Yeah.
So if I left anybody out, my apologies. The the question that I ask is, what does justice look like for you?
Mm. Mm.
Now, what justice looks like for you in the moment that you receive that text is probably bigger, bolder, more angry, slamming your foot down, slinging the phone, screaming, crying. And that if you ask the question again, what does justice look like for you 3 months later? It might be, I want to better understand their decision to disinherit me. And I'd like to investigate with them. And I'm using the language of investigation, but, really unpack what is it that led them to that decision. And of course, it takes two people minimally to have the conversation. If you're seeking to get the answers from them, if you want to do your own personal inner work, it's an entirely different
Mhm.
experience. And the key there is to, establish boundaries perhaps, or to feel good about you, to know that it's not about you, it's about them. And to know that your journey is for you, it's not for them. That it's kind of two parallel tracks. And coaching, I think in therapy allows it too. And yet I think therapy is more about a past trauma action, and that you're unpacking that and reliving that and figuring out how to move through that. And coaching is about now and in the future. Make sense?
Yeah, I think what I found in my therapy over the years, which has been a lot of it is just what you're saying, right? Is a lot of it is sort of looking at past events, actions, statements, feelings, and trying to resolve those and let those sort of like pass out of the body, you know what I mean? So that it
Hmm.
feels healed, a sense of healing. I also do a lot of I've been very, very lucky to have some really great providers run using EMDR, which is taking stuff that happened in the past, but feels like it's still
Yeah.
happening, like right now, you know? And so getting to a point where it's like, let's process this so that it doesn't feel like a continuous present, that it is actually, you know, you're freed of that. And you can now say that that is something that happened to you. It's not, you're not exhibiting symptoms and behaviors as if that past thing is currently still coming after you, you know, like right now. But I do feel like what you're saying right now, that does resonate in terms of that the work with you and folks that like you that do this, that
Hmm.
it would be like, what are then those steps
Yeah.
forward? And
And
how it can also pair with the therapy, you know, because I remember my therapist
absolutely.
talking about, you know, like, well, I mean, there's also the, you know, is there a need for like some medication, which I've been on before, which I want to, you know, be like, there's no stigma, there shouldn't be stigma because that gives you sort of an emotional floor, you know, so you're not
Hmm.
experiencing these emotional extremes. And how do you like well resource yourself on a day-to-day basis? But then pairing that, I think, with your work could really be, you know, I can see the benefit of that as we're talking about it here.
Yeah. And choosing a coach who specializes in work around forgiveness, and the opposite of that is guiding people to assist release resentment, bitterness, judgment.
Mhm.
Some people need to see the other side of the coin. In fact, that's where people are coming from. When they want to coach with me, they're not actually saying, I want to learn how to forgive myself or someone else. They want to get rid of that pain point. They have this self-awareness that this is not serving them anymore.
Mhm.
I mean, this is the challenge, is that the reasons we don't forgive often have to do with we don't understand the benefits
Mhm.
of forgiveness. We don't know how to forgive. And get this one, pretty easy. We get something out of not forgiving.
Mm.
That's a really good question. It's like, what are you getting out of not forgiving? So, to wrap things up, in the heat of the pain and suffering, there is a benefit because that anger is not self-righteous. That anger, that pain, that sadness is protection. It's self-protection. It's almost it's a boundary that says, this brings this emotion up in me, and that's why. And yet, if 5 years have gone by and your dad, I'm not sure in the context of who your parents are, but your dad is now 80 and hopefully not, but is diagnosed with an illness and has 3 months to live, would you want to do something differently?
That is a huge question. And unfortunately, I've got 30 seconds left in the break, but I see where you're going there. Folks, you need to go to embraceforgiveness.com to continue this conversation with Louisa, a variety of different ways that you can do that through her website, whether it is personal, through courses, and more. Thank you, Louisa, so much for being here on The Gailey Show.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
See you after the break. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I could just talk to Louisa forever. I can't believe how fast that segment went. But right now, we close out every Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly with my essay series, Queer and the Cosmos, where I look at the world and look at my life and consider what queer life is through the lens of learning about the cosmos. And so we're going to start with an essay titled Light Year 3. Light Year 3. As a queer kid, I don't know if I fantasized about flying because I wanted to fly or to fly away. To fly meant to point my fists into the sky and rocket upwards, to zoom around the tree line, swooping up into the atmosphere, keeping an eye out for airplanes, laying my back on top of the fuzzy clouds as I floated above the Michigan Sea, diving back down to earth so fast people would scream, only to pull up, just so, to touch my toes gently on grass and soil again. To fly away meant less to enjoy the sensations and mechanics of flying and more to just get away. Not to be where I was, but in a permanent way. Flying away did not imply migration back. Flying away meant freedom, escape. As you can imagine, then, as a queer kid, I was obsessed with Peter Pan. For my queer brain, it was a dream come true. A good looking boy who breaks into your bedroom through the window in the dead of the night, regaling you with stories of Neverland, where you don't have to grow up to get HIV, be kicked out, disinherited, or killed. Sure, Peter was obsessed with Wendy, but there was a whole island of lost boys, and maybe they wouldn't all be gay like me, but they would be lost too, so not jerks. And maybe there would be one or two other boys who were gay, but who cares? We wouldn't be lost, really. We would be rebels, rejecting this world. If all you had to offer was disease and death, well, forget you. We're all flying away. At night, through my window, I thought a lot about Peter Pan and flying. Which star was the one that was the second to the right? If it's 2 stars over, well, where do you start? Where is right? There was a really bright star in the evenings, but it was always by itself. There was never a star to the left of it, so it couldn't be the second star to the right. And as it turns out, it wasn't even a star, it was a planet, Venus. I thought about what it would be like to stand on my roof barefoot, feeling the grit of the shingles on my toes, under my toes, and then lifting off, hovering just inches with sticky grains of those shingles stuck to my feet. I thought about what Peter's face would look like, his encouraging blue eyes, yet a mocking smirk, as he held out his hand to me. Let's go already. How terrifying it would be, floating slowly upwards at first to acclimate to the cold air, the height, to prevent dizziness, and watching your home shrink and shrink behind you. Saying goodbye to your entire reality might be sad after all. But then Peter, impatient, would tug on my arm. That way he'd point, and finally, I would know which was the second star to the right. Of course, I wish I could say this was all just fantasy, that I didn't actually believe Peter Pan was real. I wish I could say that, but one afternoon, in a raging fight with my mom, overwhelmed, knowing how angry she was and how apoplectic she would be, how volcanic her rage would be if she knew the truth about me, and how impossible it all was, trapped as a queer kid who didn't ask for this, in a house that so freely and excitedly condemned gay people to death and to hell. I raced up to my bedroom, slammed the door, ran to my desk, and wrote a furious letter to Peter Pan. I need to get away from here, I begged. I can't take it anymore. Help me. Please help me. I folded up the letter, opened my window, and with the full faith of a queer kid, knowing that the wind would take my letter straight to Peter Pan, I tossed it out the window, and a gust caught it within a second. It grabbed that piece of paper and whipped it around the side of the house. Wow, I thought. That was fast. But the letter didn't get to Peter Pan. I'm sure you're surprised to hear that. No, the wind betrayed me. It took that letter and flung it to the ground on the side of the house, where my mom found it. And she laughed. She laughed and laughed. She cried. She laughed so hard. What a stupid kid. Peter Pan. What does all this have to do with the cosmos, you ask? Well, it was an early lesson in the metaphor of gravity. The gravity. The most influential force in the universe. Inescapable. When the mass of something is so great, so uncontestable, it will draw everything towards it. No escape. And for me, as a queer kid, there was no escape from heterosexism and homophobia. It was too big, too massive. Gravity prevented me from flying and flying away. As gravity crushes hydrogen into a star, this hatred of queer people was crushing me into something I didn't understand and I was afraid of. But there was more to gravity than I realized. And that's next time on Queer and the Cosmos, where I will continue essay Lightyear 3. Thank you so much for joining me here on The Gailey Show. I feel really privileged to have conversations like I had today with Louisa Hext on what forgiveness is. And I feel very privileged that you all take the time to listen to this Queer and the Cosmos series. If you want to start the series from the beginning, you can go back to am950radio.com. You can go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify or even to our YouTube channel and just go back a few Thursdays and pick it up there. It's always at the end of our thinking queerly, thinking clearly, rather thinking queerly. Wow, it has been a week. I've been talking so much. All of the words are stringing together. We will be back here tomorrow at 2 p.m. We've got some film previews for you of two excellent films that came out in 2024, The Writer and What We Wrote Together, as well as we will have Morgan rescheduled from last week about his memoir, My Unleashing. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your Thursday. Stay tuned. The Matt McNeil Show is up next, and stay tuned after that for Native Roots Radio.